No one needs to hear what you have to say.
I don't want to be locked down, thanks.
Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatest thirst upon them. I think the education system may be necessary, but it's absolutely crap. Everyone uses the internet. The level of education is lower and lower and lower in Britain year after year after year. It's too expensive now, and you can even do a degree with Google, Microsoft, or Amazon, and they might hire you in the end. On 0 hour basis, but so why bother?
Education, education, education. In the United Kingdom, we have some of the best schools and universities in the world. In today's information society, education is the engine of growth and the fuel. Coming from a working class background, it was my route into the media via Oxford University and the London School of Economics. I had no money, no social status, but I did have a brain and ambition. I learned how to write at Oxford. With a scholarship, I was given the mental space and the time to study and write a thesis of my own choosing about identity, mass culture, and post-industrial society. It took me ages, but I am proud of it. The end result wasn't a commodity. It was an eye-opener, a learning to be shared. Of course, it's easy to criticise today's university system. Yes, it's become very commoditised. Yes, there is massive grade inflation. Yes, there is no certainty of outcome, a job at the end of it all. But in today's economy, information is capital. We need to gather it in like the harvest, feed and water it, sowing the seeds of growth each year. At its root, education is the great enabler and protector of mankind. Needed now more than ever.
I didn't particularly get on well with structured education because I'm dyslexic. So I spent most of my school life being told I wasn't good enough, even though I had creative and sort of thoughtful ideas about many different subjects. I found it difficult to communicate that in a way which the established system valued. I went to the Royal Northern College of Music, which arguably was the only way I was going to get a degree given my struggle with the written word, and I found that education just fabulously helpful in so many different ways. After graduating from the Royal Northern College of Music, I worked as a classical musician for around 5 years, and then I transitioned into management in arts organisations. Obviously fundraising is a significant part of that, and then I found myself at Oxford University as a fundraiser and as a director of corporate relations, which ultimately took me to a journey with China. At the time I was a classical musician working in Manchester, and I wanted to start getting into the management side more. and the best way to do that at the time was to go for the fundraising approach. And the only reason why I got the job at the Scottish Chamber Orchestra was that in the interview I made a joke about fundraising being quite important, because they gave me a chipped cup with some water in it in the interview process. My wife moved her career down to the Midlands, and I followed with nothing to go to. And my brother had studied at Oxford, and I thought it might be an interesting place to work. So I applied for a job that I didn't want within the law faculty, on the basis it was just a good idea to get to know some people at Oxford. And that worked very well. The following day, after the interview, they phoned me up and said, "Ollie, you're not right for the law faculty, but there's a job coming up at the business school which we think you might be a good fit for." Of course, at the time I laughed and said, "Well, why would I be interested in a management school when I've got a creative arts background?" And they very wisely just said, "Come and meet the dean." And that's what I did. Whilst I was at Oxford University, I started off purely just being a fundraiser, helping them raise philanthropy and corporate support for their programs and teaching. And over the 7 years I was there, that changed and broadened to become more around corporate relations and also executive education sales. The true privilege of Oxford is actually the people you meet there, and the way in which you can become inspired by truly great minds. I was very fortunate because my boss was a sort of entrepreneurial academic who was very generous with me in terms of sort of mentoring and support and seeing a bigger picture in the world. Unfortunately, as with all companies or great institutions, such places are also packed with mediocrity. So it's only probably 3 or 4 people that you might meet who fundamentally change how you think and how you behave. Whilst I was at Oxford University working there, I took the opportunity to do as much executive education as I could. So I did programs on leadership, negotiation, and the final program I did was a master's diploma in strategy and innovation. And whilst I was doing that program, it struck me that actually, although China wasn't a core part of the program or core focus for the program, for my generation it's all about China. How we integrate China economically, politically, in every way is absolutely key to the future of the world. And I struggled with myself for a couple of weeks after that, because I took the view that, well, if I'd really come to that conclusion, I needed to make a change. And that's quite tough to do, but I did it. I resigned from Oxford and I went to go and work for China. At Chung Kong Graduate School of Business, my role was essentially to set up the whole European business and represent them in the European market. So it literally was a start-up, although be it funded with deep pockets. And it was a wonderful and fascinating period of my life. It was the most challenging thing to do I'd ever done, emotionally and also intellectually. But I've emerged from it a stronger and I think a broader person, and with just wonderful friends in China. Actually, funnily enough, I was chatting to my former boss this morning for an hour and a half on a Zoom call, catching up on some stuff. CKGSB is a very special institution, partly because it was the only and first faculty-governed business school in the Chinese context. So it's got a different governance relationship than state-run universities. It's faculty-governed. And secondly, the CKGSB has really focused on educating the private entrepreneurs across China. So I think those two things have made it the leading business school in China. This interesting combination of access to the entrepreneurial elite in China and drawing on their companies for research and networks, but also this faculty governed institution that can look at China both as part of China, but also more traditionally in the West as critique of China. I was employed by the Chung Kong Graduate School of Business by writing to them and suggesting that they might appoint me. And at the time I was working for Oxford University and delivering a Oxford Business Forum in China at the State Guest House in Beijing. So I had a letter which I'd crafted very carefully, translated into Chinese, and I sent it to them and I said I was going to be in Beijing and perhaps we should meet up. Building trust with China is a multi-phase process which requires a couple of key things. One is a real ability to look back at yourself as new. What we all forget, like the water like the fish that doesn't see the water, is that we are a product of our own environment and we are a product of our own culture. And we don't see that culture unless you take yourself out of it and force yourself to look back at yourself. So part of building trust with China is understanding how you are seen by China and how you may inadvertently create problems for yourself or undermine trust just by the nature of who you are. I think the second thing that comes is necessary to build trust with China is real loyalty and commitment to figuring out how to make it work. That's not about signing up to party rhetoric or becoming a supplicant in a relationship, but it is about demonstrating to your Chinese friends or partners that you are 100% dedicated to this journey of figuring it out together. The third thing, of course, that you need to build trust with China is time. You need to go through periods of intense conflict with people in China, I think, because only through conflict do you demonstrate this, my second point, which is that you are totally committed to figuring it out. Of course, people are going to make mistakes along the way, but the question is do you walk away from conflict or do you keep moving ahead and try and find a way through it? That is the only way, I think, you can build trust with China. I set up Ageability out of frustration. At the time, I was working for CKGSB, and part of our job was to educate Westerners on China. And the problem was that Westerners didn't want to learn. The market didn't really understand what knowledge it needed to acquire to survive in this century. So we were having a team discussion about how do we get Westerners to understand that they need to know what they need to know. And one of my colleagues turned to me and he said, well, Ollie, the problem is that these Westerners, they've got no fucking ageability. And I turned to Matt and said, Matt, that is the name of our company, Ageability. That afternoon, we checked out that the name was available and we set it up. The main work that we do with clients is helping them think through their China opportunity or challenge. So a lot of it's to do with strategy and helping them understand how to get through a route of how to deal with China and what China means to them. I think the second part of what we do is mostly around coaching and ongoing support. To work successfully with China, you have to live outside your comfort zone most of the time, and you have to constantly remind yourself of things which are uncommon in your normal environment. And you can't do that unless you've got someone by your side helping you think through the challenges that you meet. And then finally, the puzzle that we help people with China is accessing contacts, partners, customers, and helping them in that B2B matching. The Asiability works because it's built by a group of highly experienced individuals who have been there and done it with China going back to 1974. Books, courses, they're useful to some degree, but at the end of the day, working with China, the only thing that really works is drawing on experience. And understanding how that experience is relevant to contemporary China and how you can address challenges, opportunities as you go along. It's that real-world practitioner experience, I think, that we really contribute. From a economic point of view, we've massively dropped in income, mostly because our Western clients have just put all projects on pause, and they say, well, let's look at it in October. So economically, that's had a big impact on us, although it's not been difficult to manage because we're fortunate to run quite a lean ship. I think, secondly, there's a major problem in society, in the global society today, as views of China continue to be polarized by people like Donald Trump, who uses China as a distractor for the US voting public, distracting them from the US's own failures at home. It's very useful to have a common enemy if you're trying to pull people together. So I see, in terms of the tone of what we do and engaging with the marketplace, the danger, I think, now is that people are either branded as a hawk on China or an apologist on China. And of course we are neither. We are pragmatic doves trying to make sense of it. You know, you're not going to change China by telling it to change. The only thing you can change is how you deal with it and your response to it and how you think about it. That's really your only point of control. Unfortunately, this hawk and apologist issue is a threat for our business, because people can sometimes misunderstand us as apologists, which we're clearly not. I'm not sure that China does need to rebuild trust and credibility with the people who matter in the UK. I think there's an awful lot of noise around China in the UK, as there is so in the US and other parts of the world. And I think what's really important is to separate the noise and actually how governments function. I think those that have been involved in programs to understand the coronavirus, for example, at Oxford University, have had great relationships and continue to work well with China. I think, broadly speaking, our own government, the people who are in post, continue to have a great relationship with China and their counterparts in China. So I'm not sure it's one of trust. I think it's one more of public perception, and the question is will that public perception be used to ultimately derail good things that we can do together as nations? I think the most important thing that we can do now is increase communication, high quality communication between the UK and China. And we're involved in a number of initiatives to strengthen that. You know, the worst thing we can do, and which some countries are doing, is retreating to talk about China rather than work and talk with China. The West is busy retreating away from China, and that's a major problem. And I think the UK is well positioned to use its independence and be friends with both the US and China and find pragmatic ways to make that sense for the UK itself and the people of the UK.
Margaret Thatcher certainly recognized the importance of building an economy that was going to be more resilient, less exposed to the very clear vulnerabilities that existed at that time, and solved some problems, but in the process created others. And that is exactly what I'm talking about, that we haven't got away from that. We're still operating in a political and economic sphere which understands how one can address some issues, but not address issues in the round. So privatization was in many respects a significant development, but has been subsequently revealed to have created lots of problems. And the reason why we're in this position is that we are not promoting the notion that a fundamental function of economies and of business is to solve problems, and to do so in an economically and commercially viable way. The way in which I define it is in terms of the purpose of business is to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for people and planet. We simply have not captured this idea that a company should not record a profit if it's producing a problem, and it hasn't tried to clean up the mess it's created. So it isn't very difficult to shift the system in such a direction that it profoundly alters the way in which people behave going forward. But until it's recognized that those who are benefiting, those who are accumulating massive amounts of wealth during this crisis, are doing so not at the expense of others. Until that is thought to be the case, we are going to intensify the social problems that we've currently encountered. That, James, is a counterfactual question, which is particularly difficult to answer, because not only does one have to put Margaret Thatcher into the context of the current situation, but one also has to say, well, how would she have been affected by what she's observed? And how might she have changed her attitudes and her policies as a consequence of what she's observed over the last 20 years? And to do that, I think is quite a tall order. But if I took the Margaret Thatcher of the 1980s and say, well, you know, what would she perceive as being the problems now? I think her view would be that, in essence, we need to ensure that the economy, the business sector, can essentially go back to doing what it's done in the past in terms of promoting growth and investment, and should not be inhibited by the state in doing that. And that is the fastest way of getting us out of our current dilemma, because after all, she did inherit a period of recession, very bad economic performance. Now, do I think that that solves the problem? It comes back to what I was saying earlier on. It may solve the problem in one respect, but it's likely to cause massive problems in other respects. And I think that what basically happened after her period, or even during her period, was that those problems began to surface really quite rapidly. The evidence in terms of the impact, in terms of the health effects of the way in which we've managed the crisis has not suggested that we've done well. in terms of the speed of the response, in terms of the nature of the response, and in particular in terms of the way in which we have tried to manage it. Now, of course, one can say it's all very well to look back with hindsight, but in essence, the best form of analysis that we can undertake is in terms of international comparisons and evaluate how well one government appears to have done in relation to others. Now, there are obvious problems with doing that because circumstances vary. But on most scores, the response of this government in this country to what has happened seems to have left a lot to be desired and a lot of lessons that could have been learned in terms of the speed and the nature of the response. I think in terms of the immediate bailout of the business sector, that was absolutely the right thing to have done. Indeed, what saved us during the financial crisis was basically Gordon Brown's intervention, by which he cajoled countries around the world to take a concerted effort to bail out the banking sector. And if that hadn't happened, consequences would have been absolutely devastating. And likewise, and actually more significantly, if governments around the world had not intervened on the scale at which they did in March and April, then the consequences of that would have been beyond imagination. So I think that that was absolutely right. The question is, what happens next? It has to answer that, not so much in terms of the question of to what extent is a sector ailing, but in terms of what is the potential for that sector going forward and how does it need to change going forward. Now, one of the key problems that the government and the financial sector faces now is how does it distinguish between the gems and the fakes? That is to say, those that are potentially really important companies that have the potential for putting themselves back on their feet and flourishing, as against those that are simply not viable going forward. So there is that selection requirement in terms of identifying what really needs to and should be bailed out at this point. But there's then a second question about, well, what type of recovery do we want to have? And how do we encourage companies going forward to recognize that what is anticipated of them is very different from what happened in the financial crisis? I just said that, you know, what Gordon Brown and other governments did in terms of bailing out the banks was absolutely right. And there was initially a considerable amount of public and political support for that, because there was a realization that that was needed to save our financial systems. But that rapidly turned to derision when banks failed to respond, or failed to respond sufficiently rapidly in recognizing that they operated under a social license to operate. There was an expectation as to what banks should be doing to uphold our interests as customers, as lenders and borrowers and society more generally. And they failed to do that. Now, if that happens this time round, and business doesn't realize, you know, what people are expecting of it in terms of the nature of the recovery, the political ramifications are going to be far more serious than during the financial crisis. Yes, there are lots of special cases, but it's certainly a very important spend. Why do I say that so definitively? Because education is so important for everybody. And I want to come back to one of the points I was making earlier on about the failure of government in this country and in some other countries to recognize the importance of letting go, devolving control to localities, to regions, to cities, because those know the problems that they face and need to resolve, and central government doesn't. But there is a strong sense that they can't let go, because the degree of knowledge and expertise as to how to do it doesn't exist. And because we've run such a centralized system, we have indeed run down the quality of administration that we have in many parts of the country. And it's vital that we build the educational capabilities to allow that sort of administration to be done on a very local basis. Now, to do that, we need to recognize that education is not just about providing people with the skills of a university and intellectual skills. It's about training and skills of people in different types of professions, and also in the public sector. And we need to develop the capability of providing people with that sort of knowledge and skills that allows people to have trust in them to delegate decision taking down to local levels, down to the shop floor, so that we don't run all our organizations and administrations from the top. I think that education has not always understood its purpose and what it's there to do. I'll give you an illustration in terms of the key role that further education colleges should be performing in doing exactly what I'm talking about, in terms of allowing people to develop the skills base. The extent to which we have invested in that part of our economy, I think, has been seriously deficient. And that it's when educational institutions have a clear understanding of what role they are playing in society that they can then function in such a way as to start addressing the real needs that we face as individuals and societies. So I don't think crisis is the word that I would use. I would use the notion of opportunity. And that's really a lot of my views about the current pandemic crisis as a whole. View it as an opportunity, not simply as a crisis, an opportunity to put back onto a sound footing areas of our economy and our institutions that were seriously in need of reform beforehand, but have now been shown to be much more exposed than they previously were. And I think education falls into that category of having been demonstrated to be very exposed and in need of some quite fundamental reforms going forward. Yes, I think we will observe that some universities and colleges are simply not financially viable. Not the norm in the sense that it substitutes for personal learning. It's like technology in so many regards. Technology is a remarkably valuable addition to human interaction. But it's not a substitute for human interaction. And we should recognize, on the contrary, what technology allows one to do is to have more human interaction. But it allows one to take the repetitive, more mundane elements of the way in which we interact with each other out of our interactions and allow us to focus on what really matters. And that's going to be true of education. We're going to be able to get the best lecturers and professors online lecturing to us. You won't have to go along to see a lecture by your own local university professor. But that won't substitute for the direct interaction between a student and their teacher. And so what it will allow is for that much more personal interaction, which has been a feature, in particular of my university at Oxford and at Cambridge, to become a much more widespread form of university, college, school teaching across the board. What I want to see coming out of the technological revolution is a greater emphasis on the human element, not a smaller emphasis. Potentially fantastic. Why? Because what I think Europe has demonstrated is that it can provide an alternative to the extremes that we've observed in both the US and in China, in terms of a more inclusive, pluralistic approach to the way in which we run our economies and societies, where we can enjoy a far more greater degree of diversity, of lifestyles, of political systems, where we are not simply emphasizing either the functioning of markets on the one hand or the need for state control on the other, but realizing that actually there is a very powerful technique for bringing together different parts of economies to promote a much more successful system of operation than one observes elsewhere in the world. So the potential for Europe is phenomenal. The potential for it to fail is also immense. And which of those occurs depends on how it's run from the center. If Europe tries to run itself as a United States of Europe, it won't work because it cannot, in essence, create the same sort of political center that exists in the United States. And that's not really where its strength lies. But in terms of creating an environment in which many different types of approaches are followed and can yet exist together, then Europe's potential will be realized. And that requires exactly what I was talking about in relation to domestic governments, a notion of being able to let go, to encourage decisions to be taken at a national and a local level. So what one's observing in terms of the dispute over Brexit, I think is very unfortunate, because it should be recognized that different countries should be able to operate within the system in very different ways and to feel that they are part of it, but in a way that is suited to their particular way of operating. And I think that type of outcome going forward is what we will see Europe steadily moving towards. At least that is what I very much hope to see emerging. Over the next few years, I think that the UK is going to go through a very difficult period. And the reason for that is that I think that its economic system is not well structured to deal with the type of shock that we've just encountered. I think the high degree of centralization, both within the public sector and also in terms of the way in which we run the private sector, from the City of London. I think that creates serious problems. And I think that we have a significant issue in terms of the way in which we're going to be able to manage the current crisis alongside the process of trying to separate ourselves from Europe. So it's going to be a complex and difficult period over the next few years. How is the UK going to do in the long term? That very much depends on how it decides to restructure its institutions going forward. Now, the UK has a very pragmatic approach to such issues. It's got a very strong analytical basis. It has a history and an underpinning of philosophical ideas that could be a very sound basis for reforms going forward. So I'm hopeful that in the medium term, those ideas will begin to prevail, because coming back to Friedman's notion that it's the ideas that determine the actions that are taken, those ideas that prevail in Britain could be a very positive basis for reform going forward. Through what I think it was doing approximately 10 years ago, when it was recognizing that it was on a path to reform that meant it was embracing some of the ideas from other countries around the world, but not seeking to do so in a way that involved implementing the standard types of capitalist systems that were seen to be the dominant forms. So it was looking for an alternative form of freeing up the economy. But then from about 2012-13 onwards, it went in exactly the opposite direction of centralizing control and introducing what has become an increasingly autocratic system of government. And I don't think that that's healthy for China. I don't think it's healthy for its interaction with the rest of the world. And I don't think ultimately that is what China will do. I think that there will be a reversal, and I hope it's a reversal to shift it more in the direction that it was moving in about 10 years ago. But likewise, I think that other countries need to go through significant degrees of reform as well. I do not by any means think that this is a problem that only China has imposed on the world. I think that the United States has to go through a very significant degree of reform, and the prospect of that happening in relatively short order, I think, has increased significantly over the last few months. And if both those reforms happen, then I think the world that we could inherit post-COVID could be a very different one, and potentially a far less fraught one. The importance of community, that we are individuals who flourish as social beings from the interactions that we have with others, and that the potential for us to work and live together is remarkably great. And that if we find a way of doing that, then we prosper in every respect. And I think that's potentially one of the most valuable lessons that could come out of this current crisis.